Well, thank you. This is Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist, New South Wales, Australia, and I think we need to try and wrap this audit up. It's gone into the vicinity of something like 38 videos just on one study article of the Watchtower, study article 41 of the Watchtower study edition for October 2019, titled Stay Faithful Through the Great Tribulation. 38 videos I've produced as part of the audit. But we're down to the last two paragraphs now. We'll go to paragraph 18 and we'll read, what has Jehovah guaranteed? How does Revelation 7:9, 13 through 17 fill you with confidence about the future? Well, let's have a look at Revelation 7:9 and read, After this I saw, look, a great crowd. Now, the great crowd, as far as most believers understand, or theologists, or theologians, or scholars, or however you want to put it, ministers, pastors, is the body of Christ, is the church itself. That's who the great crowd is. Now, where's my controller there?
Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. We should have rolled into a new year, and we thought a bit about more Jehovah's Witnesses and thought we would touch on the topic which seems to receive very little attention. They have a two-class system, but few seem to realize that one class has a special relationship to God, while the other class is excluded from a direct relationship with God. By way of reminder, in case you forgot, I'm so conservative that I can't even turn left when I'm driving. That's not related to this topic, but it is fun to say. This is broadcast number 39, and Bob Gray is joining us again, and we're going to talk about the great crowd excluded. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. Our senior researcher, Ron Hensel, seems to be MIA, or else he could be invisibly present, and we just can't see him. Perhaps he's investigating and judging how the show goes without him. But we're glad Bob Gray has made it. Good evening, Doc Bob.
Good evening. I'm Bob Gray, and I'm not president of anything.
Are you present, though?
I am present.
And you're visible, generally?
Generally, yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, I am in the Chicago area. Ron is in the Florida area in general when he's visibly present somewhere. But in Chicago, we've had this kind of unique thing I was sharing with you before we went on, that it snowed just a touch last night, a little dusting of snow, and then started raining. Then we've had a lot of wind later in this morning. Through this evening, up to 40 to 60 mile an hour winds maybe. So it got increasingly windier, and the temperatures have gone up. And oddly enough, it seems to coincide with the arrival of our current president, Barack Obama. So I don't know if they're actually related, that the winds have increased and the hot air has increased, or if they're unrelated. But it does strike me as odd that he became visibly present in Chicago simultaneously with those changes. Okay, yes. Doc Bob, you and I were talking last week, actually, about this new series that Lee Remini has been doing on Scientology, and some of the terminologies that they use, and how they actually have the same kinds of meanings that Jehovah's Witnesses do. And one of the problems that we often have in talking with various groups is a language barrier. In some ways, by the way, it reminds me of watching someone who speaks Russian only, trying to communicate with someone who speaks English only, and in an attempt to be understood, they increase in volume, sometimes not only in loudness, but in hand gestures, as though somehow loudness and gesticulation increases the ability to get your meaning across. And it doesn't really work because you don't know what the words they are using mean to you. That is very much like talking to someone who's in a religious group, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yes.
One of the things that Robert Lifton talks about in his, he has got 8 elements of mind control. One of them is called loaded language. Loaded language, and that would be, you know what I'm talking about. What is loaded language, Bob?
Basically, it's just framing things in such a way that it makes something say something that it really doesn't say.
Well, it may, but it may not be something you understand. We have, actually, all of us have loaded language in some form, oftentimes to do with our occupations. For example, you were an electrical engineer, if I recall, right?
Yep, computer network.
Computer network and electrical engineer. So if you and I were to talk about something like, I don't know, watts and ohms and amps, that would have particular meanings to you that you would understand, but the average person out there may not understand.
Yep.
Right? It's sort of shorthand that goes with your craft or your trade, or in some cases your belief system.
Yep.
As a construction manager, I had the same kind of a thing. I would have language and shorthand terms that I would use that others in my trade would understand, and I could communicate with subcontractors of various other occupations. This is clearly true in religious discussions, but we don't always recognize that. So when we talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, they really have a 2-class system. I know when I read some of the early material, Charles Taze Russell was opposed to this idea of a 2-class system, the priestly class versus the laity class. And he just really believed everyone should be on an equal footing before God. Did I misread that, or isn't that what he taught?
Oh, and even today, when you talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll say that they don't have classes, but they do. In fact, they actually use the word class. There's the heavenly class, the earthly class. The
heavenly class and the what?
Earthly class.
Earthly class. Yeah.
Earthly. In fact, I've got a little list here. There is. Oh, it's not there. They actually have a whole bunch of class names for the anointed.
They do. While you're looking at that, I want to bring one of them up, which they don't use anymore that I know of, but one that my wife is pretty sure she's part of, and that's the John class.
Oh, yes. That was in the Revelation book. It always sounded like it had something to do with the bathroom.
Exactly.
But, well, for instance, the anointed were the Jehu class, and the non-anointed were the Jonadabs. This goes way back.
Okay.
And a lot of those class names went along with the anointed had more class names than the other sheep did. But they were the Ezekiel class, the Jeremiah class, the John class, as you mentioned, the Heavenly Bride class, the Wise Virgin class. But they don't have classes.
And yet they clearly use that terminology to denote something. So, so when they say, so are they saying they don't have class, or that the classes don't exist in the ranks?
One of the things as I was doing all the research on this is the whole thing about the little flock and the other sheep. The little flock are, of course, the 144,000 anointed. And the other sheep are the other sheep. And I've really been struck by the otherness of the other sheep and going through a lot of this.
All right. Now, for the uninitiated, I know several who will watch this were or are Jehovah's Witnesses, or at least are somewhat familiar. But for those who are not familiar, what is the anointed class? Where do they get that from? And what does it mean to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society followers?
So the anointed class are the ones who have been born again and are anointed, adopted sons of God.
Okay. And they get that from Revelation 7 and 14, correct?
Yeah. Well, basically that coincides with 144,000,
right?
Which is Revelation 7, 3 through 8 or so.
And Revelation 14 as well.
Yeah. And then they also, the great crowd are a subset of the other sheep.
Okay.
So
So
in
the
Job-
144,000 are the heavenly class.
Yep.
The other sheep or the great crowd are destined to earth only,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Okay. So that's the two-class system.
Right.
Now, something which I had not really thought of that you have brought up is within the remnant, or within the 144,000, the anointed class,
Yep.
you have subclasses.
Yes. So you have the 144,000, of which there are 144,000. They take that number literally. Then there is what is referred to as the anointed remnant. So they believe that starting in 33, when Jesus ascended to heaven at Pentecost, that's when the 144,000 started being gathered. And they were gathered up until 1935, except they changed their minds on that a couple of years ago. And so the anointed remnant are the ones who are the anointed class that are still on earth. And they are the only ones that partake of the elements, the bread and the wine, at their annual celebration of the memorial of Christ's death. Now, those numbered 18,000 this year, last year, 2016.
That sounds like it's a growing number, because it was just a few years ago, it was only 8,000.
Well, yeah, the year before it was 15,000. But they have a great way of getting around this. And actually, we'll go to gaslighting, because this is what they do to people who are of the other sheep that might be so presumptuous as to think that they've been called to heaven. And this goes, yeah. Well, this goes back. I remember them doing this all the time. I was Jehovah's Witness, which was from 1973 or so until about 1993, 4, somewhere in there. But when you listen to the language, gaslighting is, as we were talking about before. In fact, let me actually just read the definition of gaslighting. Gaslighting, and this is from Wikipedia, it's a form of manipulation through persistent denial, misdirection, contradiction, and lying in an attempt to destabilize and delegitimize a target. Its intent is to sow seeds of doubt in the targets, hoping to make them question their own memory, perception, and sanity. So with that in mind, listen to what they say. This was from 1982. It says, any who in comparatively recent times dedicated themselves and were baptized, and who consider themselves to be born again, would do well to reflect seriously on the following questions. What reason do you have for feeling that Jehovah has planted this hope in you? Could it be that your emotional feeling is a holdover from the mistaken belief you previously held while in Babylon the Great, that heaven is the destiny for all good people? Or could it be that you feel this way because you had great inward disturbances, and that you at first fought against the idea, but it gradually won out? But did it win out because you wanted it that way, perhaps even unconsciously? Such struggles do not of themselves prove that you are born again. Or do you feel that you've been chosen by God to be one of the 144,000 anointed ones because of your keen appreciation for spiritual things, because of your fondness for deep spiritual truths? Then note that ever so many who do not profess to be born again are spiritual men in the fullest sense of the word. And there's no question about the spiritual strength of the men and women of faith listed in Hebrews chapter 11. None of those were born again. All of them looked forward to a better resurrection to life under God's kingdom. Or might it be that you feel that way, feel the way you do because of your displaying more zeal than some fellow Christians? But that of itself could not be the determining factor, for the Apostle Paul, time and again, found it necessary to counsel anointed Christians in regard to taking their spiritual obligations seriously. Or could it be that your profession to be of the anointed is due to a lack of modesty? There are some who quite recently have professed to be of the anointed, but who, instead of building unity in the congregation, felt that they must have their own Bible study group. To the contrary, mature born-again Christians remain close to the local congregation, even though it is largely comprised of other sheep. However, then they cap this off. However, a person's being born again is a personal matter between God and each Christian. No one should judge another on this question. And so this was 1982. Just 2016, and this is just two short sentences. It says, some who at one point started to partake of the emblems later stopped. Others may have mental or emotional problems that lead them to believe that they will rule with Christ in heaven. So, I mean, this is classic gaslighting. Oh, could it be that you think you're born again because of some mental problems? Could it be, you know, and on it goes. It's really, it adds, I mean, you think of somebody who really feels that they are born again, and now you've got this type of language directed at them to try to call into doubt the calling of God. That's a special kind of evil.
You know, even as you're reading that, I start thinking of older comedy movies. Many will not remember what I'm going to mention now, but some of the old Ma and Pa Kettle series. This would be 1940s and 50s, where Pa Kettle is trying to borrow money, and he does this whole shenanigans that so completely befuddles the person he's talking to that after he borrows $5, he has the other guy owing him $5 as a result of lending him the original $5. It's just, it makes them crazy. Or the Marx Brothers would be another example of that.
Yep.
Where there's these big convoluted kinds of things that persuade you that you didn't see what you actually saw. Or 1970s, The Guide to the Married Man, where the wife walks in and finds her husband in bed with another woman, and as he gets up, he's caught red-handed is not exactly the word, but he's caught in bed with another woman, and he gets up and he gets dressed and he's going, what are you talking about? Another woman in our room? And by the time he gets through with the scene, he's sitting in his chair reading a paper, and she's thinking she's lost her mind.
Yep. That's gaslighting.
Gaslighting. That's gaslighting. That's exactly what it is. Okay.
Yeah.
So they hold the anointed up as some special place with God. They have a special relationship. They are Christ's brothers and sisters. In fact, at one time they taught, and I don't think they've stopped teaching this, that they are also Christs. So essentially you have 144,001 Christs. They're all mediators, which is what anointed means, right?
Yeah. Well, at one time in the 20s, they literally taught that the term Christ referred to 144,000 plus Jesus.
Right. Now, have they ever reversed that actually, or do they just not talk about it anymore?
They don't explicitly teach that, but for all the years I was a Jehovah's Witness, more often than not, those who were remaining were just called the anointed.
Right.
It's Christ.
Okay. Now this group, this anointed class, which will all be in heaven with Christ, some of which are the remnant.
Yeah, that are still
the
here.
Remnant is who?
That's the ones that are still on the earth, the 18,000 that partook of communion.
The 18,000 that partook of communion.
Yeah.
And now, if I was the average Jehovah's Witness, would I think that the 18,000 are the ones who are together interpreting Scripture?
You would have up until 2013.
Okay, would have thought that up until 2013,
and now the faithful and discreet slave,
which is
so this comes
different than the anointed class.
It is now.
It is now. Okay.
Yes. So Russell originally taught the faithful and discreet slave comes from Matthew 24:45, when Jesus had the parable and he asked the rhetorical question, who really is the faithful and discreet slave that his master on returning finds him, he was assigned to provide food for the household, and master comes back, find him doing what he's supposed to, and he's a good guy. Russell originally taught that the faithful and discreet slave were all anointed Christians.
Okay.
In I think it was 95, Russell's wife argued in the pages of the Watchtower that the faithful and discreet slave was Russell himself. And from everything I read, a lot of Bible students back then agreed with that. Then they corrected that mistake in 1927, and it went back to being all of the anointed Christians on earth. And they taught that up until 2013. And the governing body really kind of paved the way for this for several years, because at one point it was the faithful and discreet slave were all of the anointed. And then the governing body started referring to themselves as the spokesman for the faithful and discreet slave. And then in 2013, they declared that they were the faithful and discreet slave, because all of the other anointed were not involved in the feeding work.
Okay.
And what really happened there was that the governing body specifically excluded the rest of the anointed. So when they came up with a change in doctrine, they didn't go out and check with the other, 8,000, 9,000, however many there were at the time. They basically did it themselves. And then they used the fact that those others were not involved in the feeding work for saying, well, they can't really be part of the slave because they're not part of the feeding work. So the population of the faithful and discreet slave went from about 9,000 down to 7 with a single declaration from the new faithful and discreet slave.
Okay. Okay. And so that's the numbers I'm remembering is the 8,000 or so from a few years ago.
Yeah.
But now they've done some other kind of a change has allowed the faithful and discreet slave, not the faithful and slave, the remnant to grow like rabbits, even though they're all got to be 100 years old now.
Yeah. Well, they taught for many years that the general call to become anointed ended in 1935, because that's when they identified who the other sheep.
Yeah, Dr. Jason Morrison, theologist again. I just want to say thank you for watching the videos, and I hope you got plenty of self-rediscovery and freedom out of it. If you watched it on YouTube, please share or like, maybe even comment. If you watched it on Facebook, like, comment, share. But most of all, get out and live. This isn't a rehearsal. You've got a one-off life. Don't let your loyalty and your faithfulness blind you to the life that you should be experiencing. Till the next video, thank you for watching, and bye for now.